Hello, dear friends, and welcome to part 5 of this whispered read-through of the 70 Great Mysteries of the Ancient World, unlocking the secrets of past civilizations. A lovely book, fascinating, looking at the myths and legends throughout history and analysing the archaeological or historical evidence or fact behind them. Let's jump right into number 21 with the question, who were the first Australians? 40 to 60,000 years ago perhaps in Australia. Long time ago, before Captain Cook, we see moccasins. They come with bara, they leave with balloonu. According to some traditional beliefs of Australia's indigenous people, their ancestors were created in the dreaming, which we covered in the previous video. This was a period where all landscape and humans were formed, so to them there's no mystery to their origins. But for scientists, the timing and the arrival of the first Australians has been a burning question for 200 years. Who are they? Where did they come from? Here we have a map of Australia, Indonesia and South Asia, which also show the former land masses of Sahul and Sunda. So at low sea levels there's a broad front between the two land masses of Australia and Southeast Asia. Here is James Barabang pointing to a painting of an Indonesian prau. So Aboriginal history isn't a history of isolation. They came into contact with other civilizations. So Australia was colonised from the north, from the southeastern Asian landmass across what are now Indonesia and Malaysia. There are fossils of Homo erectus found in Java in the 19th century by Eugene Dubois and proposed as possible ancestors of the first Australians. So research shows that Homo erectus was in Java 1.74 million years ago. Sea levels, of course, change over time and the land masses will change. The only way to get to Australia, though, from Sahul was by boat or canoe, so it's not hard to imagine anatomically modern humans just like us in thought and ability, constructing bamboo rafts powered by sails woven from leaves. And then the currents and the windfall would have guaranteed that journey over to what is now Australia. So it was likely to have been colonised by organised expeditions, and they may have numbered in the thousands. So, until the middle of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed that the first migration took place between the last glaciation, which is between 25,000 and 13,000 years ago, when the sea levels were last low. But by the early 1970s, it was clear that the first Australians had arrived well before that. Radiocarbon dating shows 9,000 years ago in 1961 to 38,000 years ago in 1981. So the pace of this discovery has pushed back the earliest evidence of occupation. There is considerable debate about the dating methods, though, and the interpretation of the results. So some argue there's no convincing evidence of occupation before 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, but others claim that 60,000 years is a conservative estimate. We do know that people spread throughout the continent 40,000 years ago. There are now dates greater than 35,000 from Maureen in Tasmania, Allen's Cave on the Nullarbor Plain, Upper Swan in southwestern Australia, and Willandra Lakes near the Murray and Darling rivers. Lots of different places. So the first Australians would have encountered changing climates, different environments, and during periods of low sea levels, when New Guinea and Tasmania were attached to Australia. Small glacial caps would atop the dividing range, southern dividing range and the higher peaks, and then spring meltwaters would have fueled rivers 9 times the volume of present-day ones. Here we have Homo erectus of Southeast Asia, with detailed similarities to early Australians. The skeleton from Wajak comes in the boundary of the two great land masses, and near the origins of the agriculture of the region. And here is Mungo, a man buried on the edge of Lake Mungo in southeastern Australia, perhaps as much as 60,000 years ago. So it carries with it a mitochondrial DNA within the Australian family and distinct from African lineages. Now, modern indigenous Australians vary physically from region to region, as do of course Europeans or any other continental group. So the reasons behind this could be that migration models assume multiple origins and different ancestral groups. Evolutionary models account for biological variation by examining processes of selection for different environments as well as marriage patterns. So, for much of the 20th century, migration models were used to explain the range of physical differences. Before radiocarbon dating was invented in 1941, Joseph Birdsall argued that the three waves of migration by different colonizing groups accounted for the observed differences. And by the early 1970s, Alan Thorne proposed the dual migration model. The discoveries at Cow Swamp provided the evidence for heavily built, robust people living among the Murray River in southeastern Australia. And the remains from Lake Mungo were lightly built. So the larger and more robust group traced their ancestry to Homo erectus in Java, while the more gracile were from further afield in China. People living in a desert environment over tens of thousands of years tend to develop a slender, slighter appearance with relatively longer limbs. So the people of the Willandra Lakes were desert dwellers during glacial times. Equally, adaptation can explain to a significant degree the sturdy build of those in a resource-rich area such as the Murray River. So investigations show that on average most of these individuals from more than 10,000 years ago were larger and more heavily built. They had the largest teeth of any human group and a sweeping forehead and well-developed brow ridges. And others such as Keilor and many of the Willandra Lake skeletons are less ruggedly built and they're physically closer to modern Aboriginal people. So recent research into the origins of anatomically modern humans and their spread throughout the world are polarized into two models: regional continuity and out of Africa. In the first, Homo erectus spread through Eurasia from Africa and reached Java by 1.74 million years ago. Evolution from Homo erectus occurred across the Old World, with all populations linked by intermarriage. Modern Homo sapiens appeared about 130,000 years ago. Under this model, the fossils of Homo erectus found at Solo and Angdong are the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians. Under the out of Africa model, modern humans developed in Africa 130,000 years ago, and in a geological instant moved across Asia, perhaps sailing the coasts of India and South Asia to settle Australia by 60,000 years. And then along the way they killed all resident populations of Homo erectus and made the step to Australia that eluded the people that had lived so close than 1.5 million years. So, according to the out of Africa model, the fossils of Homo erectus from Java, Solo and Ngandong are pruned from the Australian family tree. And the first Australians are descended from the ancestors who appeared in Africa 130,000 years ago. The regional continuity model still identifies Homo erectus as the ancestor of the first Australians. So why did they not make, if the Homo erectus model, why did they not make the last short crossing to Australia, or did they? The regional continuity model leaves open the possibility that we will eventually see evidence of humans in Australia at more than 100,000 years ago, although unlikely, it's not impossible. Here we have the question of the first Americans and Kennewick Man. Sometime before 15,000 to 9,300 years ago in North and South America. Tom DeLay in 2000 says, "I believe the picture that emerges will show us one of the most intricate, thrilling and inspiring episodes of the human adventure on Earth." So of course in 1493, Christopher Columbus, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, paraded a small group of Native Americans before the Spanish court. So who were they? The court was engaged in debate. How had they reached their homeland? Had they travelled by land or sea from Asia? Had some unknown pilot crossed the Atlantic from the Mediterranean long before Columbus? Were the Indians survivors of either the lost continent of Atlantis or the 10 lost tribes of Israel? as early as 1590, Jesuit missionary Jose de Acosta speculated that the first Americans had arrived in the Americas from Asia, with only short stretches of navigation. That was almost 2 centuries before the discovery of the Bering Strait in 1743. There are a few wild claims for Ice Age voyages across the Atlantic or long canoe journeys from Australia to South America, but few scientists now challenge the Asian antecedents of Native Americans. The main scholarly debate revolves instead around the manner of the first settlement and the critical issue of exactly when initial colonization took place. Until the 1920s, most experts assumed that the first Americans had arrived within the past 4,000 years or so, but then some projectile points in direct association with the bones of extinct bison at Folsom, New Mexico demonstrated once and for all that humans had lived in the New World for at least 10,000 years. So the development of radiocarbon dating by Willard Libby in 1949 helped put the chronology of both Folsom and even earlier Clovis Paleo-Indian cultures on a firmer footing. So we can place the Clovis occupation of North America to between 13,500 and 13,350 years ago, which means that the Stone Age peoples settled in the New World within a few centuries at the end of the Ice Age, if not earlier. But the question is how much earlier? So everyone agrees that only modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, settled in the Americas, and more than a century of diligent search has revealed no traces of archaic humans such as Neanderthals. Beyond this fact, there's little agreement. These are excavations here at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, a cave occupied from perhaps as early as 15,000 years ago. A minority faction of scientists believes that humans crossed from Asia into Alaska as early as 40,000 years ago, pointing to some highly controversial excavations in northeastern Brazil as evidence for an early settlement. Except for this questionable site, Boqueira de Pedra Ferrada, there is no archaeological evidence of a 40,000-year settlement, and much scholars favour a much later date, somewhere earlier than 13,500 years ago, with settlement taking place during the late Ice Age, when sea levels were up to 300 foot lower than today, and a land bridge linked to Siberia or Alaska, the sunken continent of Beringia. So the best known archaeological site for the pre-Clovis settlement in the Americas is Monteverde, far to the south in Chile, where some wooden huts and simple stone artifacts date to between 14,000 to 13,600 years ago, a little earlier than Clovis. There's also Cactus Hill in southeastern Virginia, which could take the chronology back slightly further. There's no reason why the first settlement couldn't have taken place considerably earlier, but numbers of people involved were small, and the archaeological signature they left behind them is so inconspicuous that it's difficult to find them. Here we have a Folsom Point with ribs of extinct subspecies of bison in Folsom, New Mexico. These kind of discoveries prove that humans had settled in the North Americas within a few centuries of the end of the Ice Age, if not earlier. And these Clovis points are fine examples of the stone working expertise of some of the earliest Americans. So the routes by which humans entered the New World are also controversial. Until recently, almost everyone agreed that the first settlers crossed into Alaska dry-shod across the wind and bitterly cold steppe tundra of the Bering Land Bridge. Then from there, they crossed a narrow ice-free corridor between the two great ice sheets that covered Canada and the northern United States during and immediately after the late Ice Age, and then settling in the heart of North America. So most Paleo-Indian sites were found in the North American plains, so the first settlers were assumed to be big game hunters with a fondness for bison and mammoth or mastodon. Although this has been challenged recently by a series of new excavations that reveal the Paleo-Indians as a highly diverse group of hunter-gatherers. They exploited a very wide range of foods, and at the same time, new geological researchers have shown that the ice-free corridor from Alaska to the plains wasn't vegetated. It couldn't support animal or human life, so it would have been impossible for the first settlers to move south unless they took a coastal route. So under that scenario, they would have had to have coasted their way from Siberia along Beringian shores, then south and east along the continental shelf of Alaska. Archaeological sites would lie underwater if they exist, but there's no reason in theory why those who were equipped with skin boats couldn't have subsided off fish and sea mammals and made their way south. Here we have the foundations of wooden structures found at Monteverde in South Chile. And here is the skull of Kennewick Man, a reconstruction of his facial features here. So controversy surrounds this, one of the earliest Native Americans dating to around 9,300 years ago. So the first Americans are one of the mysteries that generate remarkable passion among scientists and lay people alike, but nowhere did this become more apparent than in Benton County in Washington, with the discovery of Kennewick Man in 1996. A human skull and limb bones were washed out of a riverbank, apparently belonging to a male Caucasoid with worn teeth, aged 40 to 45 years old at death and about 5 foot 8 inch tall. So at first the archaeologist James Chatters assumed he was dealing with a modern European, until closer inspection involved some sort of projectile in a healed wound in his right hip. The bones were then radiocarbon dated to between 9,300 and 9,380 years ago, making them some of the earliest human remains found in the Americas. While computerized tomography scans identified the mysterious projectile as a leaf-shaped cascade tape stone point. So immediately the landowners, the Bureau of Land Management, called a halt to investigations and announced that they would repatriate the bones to 5 local tribes as required by federal law. And then a group of archaeologists then sued the Bureau and Corps of Engineers in a suit which pitted scientists against the government and Native Americans. It's still not resolved at the time of writing. So from a scientific point of view, the Kennewick skeleton is of great scientific interest because of its early date and seemingly unusual anatomical features. The skull seems to resemble that of a modern Western Eurasian rather than early Native Americans or recent Native Americans. And when the early dates were announced, the press seized on the alleged European features with excitement as proof of high antiquity for non-American Indian settlement. In a recent scientific report, James Chatters confirms that the Kennewick bones differ markedly from those of modern Native Americans, especially those of northwestern North America. Though Kennewick shares many modern common features with the 6 other known Paleo-Indian males of the same approximate age. They all tend to have rather long skulls, medium to broad faces, and narrow to medium noses. They show residual traces of tropical origin, not the longer, straighter faces and shorter limbs that are characteristic of people from the far north. Kennewick is taller, a far more projecting face, and his general features are nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps his age of death is entirely normal among Paleo-Indian males who tended to die between 32 and 45. So the skeleton hints that the early occupation of North America was more complex than we currently suspect. Small groups of Stone Age people arrived in the Americas over a prolonged period of time, either during the late Ice Age or immediately thereafter. And the mystery of the first Americans remains one of the great puzzles of the past, simply because the populations were so small and their campsites so transitory. So the fascination lies not in wild theories of early European occupation or migrations across the Ice Age seas of the North Atlantic, but in the challenge of deciphering the most elusive and scattered of archaeological, biological, and linguistic clues. So the exact routes by which the first Americans reached their homeland remains an enigma. So this is the journey they believe they could have taken here. The Atlantic Paleo-Maritime route going along the coast here. Another coastal route. I mean, that's a very long way, isn't it? An overland route. I mean, what a huge journey, no matter which way you look at it. Number 23. What wiped out the big game animals at the end of the Ice Age in the Americas, Eurasia, and Australia? Paul Martin in 1999 states that the hunters swept down the Americas like a bloody wave that washed away much of the land's bounty. Here we have Paleolithic paintings and engravings of woolly mammoths dominating the animal imagery from Peshmerga Cave, south-central France. So we live in an appallingly impoverished world compared to that of our ancestors living as little as 13,000 years ago. So whether those hunter-gatherer peoples who lived in Africa, Europe, Asia, or the Americas, they were able to watch megafauna, a range of wild animals of great size, and it's virtually only in Africa where such animals survive: the elephant, giraffe, rhino, and hippopotamus. Ice Age hunter-gatherers would have seen and perhaps hunted mammoths throughout Europe, Northern Asia, and North America. Giant deer, woolly rhinos, cave bears, they're all part of the European fauna. while the Americas supported a remarkable array of creatures that had taken natural selection millions of years to produce and disappeared effectively overnight in the timescale of evolution. Here are some Columbian mammoths feeding on the Colorado Plateau, southwestern United States, around 15,000 years ago. In North America, there were not only two types of mammoth, but also an array of giant ground sloths, slow lumbering plant-eating creatures that reached up to 20 feet in length and 3 tons in weight. Wow, imagine seeing a sloth that size. Be quite hilarious. These shared the landscape with creatures such as Castorides, a giant beaver the size of a bear, Cliptodon, a giant armor-plated armadillo, Camelops, approximately known as yesterday's camel, and an assortment of carnivores that included Smilodon, a saber-toothed cat with 8-inch serrated canines. Similar stories in Australia, where there were a remarkable variety of giant kangaroos and wombats, together with marsupials that resembled rhinos and giant cats. So the sudden disappearance at the end of the Ice Age is one of the great mysteries faced by those who study the past. Only Africa remained largely unscathed by this wave of extinctions. So there are two principal theories: that the animals were wiped out either by the dramatic changes in climate that accompanied the end of the Ice Age, or by the one lethal predator that was found in each continent, Homo sapiens. So much of the debate centres around just one of them, the mammoth. Two species of mammoth became extinct: the woolly mammoth, that lived throughout northern Eurasia and North America, and the Columbian mammoth, that had been exclusive to North America, living as far south as Mexico. There are other types of megafauna. As with other types of megafauna, the mammoths went extinct between 13,000 and 11,500 years ago, except for a relict population of woolly mammoths that survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean for another 6,000 years. Quite why they survived adds to the mystery, though they did become dwarfs, no more than 6 foot high, compared with the 12 foot of a full-size mammoth. So the mammoths on Wrangel Island might have survived because the vegetation remained much the same as it had during the Ice Age, a particularly diverse mix of grasses and herbs, which provided perfect forage for mammoths. So this type of vegetation, which had been termed the mammoth steppe, was once pervasive across northern Eurasia and North America, but it was replaced with new types of vegetation as the climate grew so much warmer and wetter after 20,000 years. So in the most northern areas of the steppe, that was replaced by a boggy tundra that was slow-growing and poor in nutrients, and that was only suitable for highly specialised feeders such as the lichen-eating reindeer. And then further south, the rich mix of grasses, herbs and shrub that the mammoths depended on was lost to thick forest, prairies and semi-desert. So that's a lot of habitat lost. And the change hypothesis for mammoth extinction initially sounds very compelling, but it has run into some difficulties. The most significant is the fact that mammoths had survived many previous periods of climate change, very similar to that which occurred between 20,000 and 11,600 years ago. It's just one of the many that had occurred during the last million years and had been interspersed with periods of warm and wet climate very similar to the climate today, when forests, grasslands and tundra became prevalent. Mammoths survived all of these, presumably by retreating into refuges where some semblance of mammoth steppe survived, and then spread out again once the conditions returned. There seems no reason why they couldn't have done that at the end of the last Ice Age, but another problem with the theory is that mammoths were not the only animals to go extinct. Many of the others lived in quite different habitats, and they may have seen their preferred foodstuffs to expand with the increasing warmth and wetness. Here's the carcass of a 40,000-year-old baby mammoth, nicknamed Dima, found in 1977 in Siberia. And here's an excavation at Dent in Colorado in 1932, which produced the first clear evidence of the association of projectile points with mammoth remains in North America. So the problems with the climate theory have led to some scientists to favour the idea that they went to extinction based on hunting. It was championed by Paul Martin of Arizona University more than 30 years ago, and remains a compelling idea. He was mostly concerned with the North Americas and stressed the coincidence between the arrival of humans in this continent and the extinction of the megafauna. So his idea was that all the new arrivals swept southward across the continent, having originally arrived in Alaska. And these people, known as the Clovis culture, after the site where they were first identified, they're distinguished by their large stone spear points, a part of a large lethal hunting technology. So this yesterday's camel, the ground sloths and the mammoths had never been faced with such a predator that combined deadly weapons with the ability to hunt in large cooperative groups and set traps and ambushes. So this would have been very unlike to what they'd experienced in Africa, where they effectively co-evolved with humans as predators and may have developed patterns of social behaviour that formed a protection against human hunting, which would explain why there are so few extinctions on that continent. And there was direct evidence that mammoths were hunted by Clovis people. So several archaeological sites show mammoth remains with spear points. First discovered in Dent, Colorado in 1932, at Lena Ranch in the San Pedro Valley of Arizona, for instance, the remains of 13 mammoths were found with spear points in fireplaces. Seems to have been a family herd, slaughtered in its entirety, as it gathered at a watercourse. The overkill theory, though, also runs into problems. We have some mammoth kill sites, but there's no direct evidence that the other megafauna were being hunted, with a few rare exceptions such as the mastodon, a relative of the elephant and mammoth, bones at Kimiswake and Missouri. Ground sloths, for instance, appear to have been once abundant on the evidence of their dung found in caves. They're likely to have been easy prey. So it seems that as we learn more about the Clovis people, they were more concerned with hunting smaller animals and gathering plants. It's also becoming clear that the Clovis people weren't the first to live in the Americas. Evidence from around 14,000 years ago at a settlement at Monteverde in southern Chile shows that people in North and South America for a few thousand years lived there before the extinction occurred. The same in Australia. So climate change or human hunting? Scientists remain divided. Some support a different explanation, a lethal plague carried around the world by humans that attack the megafauna. But it could be that there is no single explanation. Some species were killed by hunting, some lost their habitat, some couldn't cope with the new climate. And of course, any one region or species were members of a dynamic ecological community. Once one species is lost, the balance between predators and prey would change and could lead to a cascade of population explosions and crashes. Indeed, mammoths have been described as keystone species, but climate change and overkill appear sufficient in themselves. They don't really seem sufficient in themselves. It appears most likely that a combination of these had such a devastating impact on animal communities. So when the Ice Age came to its end, mammoths would certainly have suffered, especially during the droughts that occurred in the American Southwest during the Clovis period and immediately afterwards. During those periods, relatively weak animals may have congregated at waterholes, much like the African elements during drought conditions today, and provided easy pickings for Clovis hunters. Even the killing of a few animals may have made all the difference between the species whose numbers would bounce back once more conducive climatic conditions returned, and one that had become condemned to extinction. This is the so-called Jefferson mammoth, a well-preserved skeleton now in the American Museum of Natural History. And we have all of the different animals that would have lived in these regions. Glyptodon there, Lipodem, Litoptern, and Otongulate. All very fascinating names. How did farming begin? It was a Neolithic revolution, says V. Gordon Childer in 1936, sometime around 12,000 to 4,500 years ago. Near East, the Mexican, China and Andes regions, Eastern United States, Sub-Saharan Africa, all over the place. Quite an interesting conversation, actually. I think I've always myself wondered how certain things start. If you think about bread as a concept, it seems so alien. If you break it down into its constituent parts, how did that process begin? How did it eventually become bread? It's really interesting. So for the vast majority of the human past, people lived by hunting and gathering, but we evolved as a species long before our ancestors began to live in settled communities with domesticated plants and animals. Farming is a novel event, and archaeologists are still far from understanding why such a radical change in human lifestyles took place. It seems to have occurred for the first time a little under 12,000 years ago in the Third Dark Crescent of the Near East. It was also independently invented in 6 other regions of the world soon after that date. Central Mexico around 9,000 years ago, a little later in both southern and northern China, then in the Central Andes around 7,000 years ago, finally in the eastern United States and Sub-Saharan Africa around 4,500 years ago. But a common factor in all of these separate developments is that farming began after the end of the last ice age, and it was probably probably closely related to the environmental changes associated with global warming, marked an increase in human population. But the type of farming invented in each region was quite different, being largely determined by what the indigenous plants and animals, barley, wheat, sheep and goats in the Near East, maize in Mexico, rice in China, millet and sorghum and cattle in sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, each area appears to have had its own unique set of specific events and causes that led to people to give up the ancestral hunting and gathering lifestyle. Here we have the base of the settlement mound at Jericho and the remains of an early farming village in which people lived in small circular dwellings, but also this large tower. Here is a Neolithic plaster head from Jericho. And here is the hunter-gatherer settlement at Abu Hurairah, Syria, found below the mud brick houses of the farming town. Drawn below had a mixed farming economy with grains and animals. So the study of the origins of farming in the Near East has a very long history. Pioneering work undertaken by Robert Braidwood during the 1940s in the Chemchenar Valley of northeastern Iraq, followed in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon's excavations at Jericho in the Jordan Valley. So this focused on the first Neolithic farming communities in the Near East, which still lacked pottery. So, much more recently, archaeologists such as Ufa Bar Yosef have shown that we need to look further back if we're to understand fully why farming began, while the archaeobotanist, that's a mouthful, archaeobotanist Gordon Hillman provided great insights by studying the still existing wildflora of the Near East, and making microscopic studies of plants from excavations. You have to pay attention to the fluctuations in climate change during the last millennia of the Ice Age, rather than just the dramatic global warming occurring at 11,600 years ago. At around 14,500 years ago, the coastal lands and river valleys of the Near East were covered with thick, mixed oak woodland. Elsewhere there was a lush steppe with a vast array of edible plant foods that included the wild ancestors of domesticated wheat and barley, the seeds of which would have been gathered in large quantities by hunter-gatherers of the Natufian culture, who began to live in permanent settlements, such as Ain Malar in Israel and Abu Hurairah in Syria, which was an unprecedented step for our ancestors to take. For around 2,000 years, these communities flourished, developing many of the cultural attributes normally associated with farmers: stone architecture, rich burials, art, and an elaborate plant grinding technology. Then, 12,600 years ago, the climate took a marked turn for the worst. Instead of warm temperatures and plentiful rainfall, they were suddenly faced with Ice Age conditions for another 1,000 years, with the associated drought and significant decline in the availability of both plants to gather and animals to hunt. So this short climatic period of the Younger Dryas appears to have occurred just as hunter-gatherer people had reached unprecedented levels and then caused maximum distress. So a permanently settled way of life couldn't be sustained anymore. So highly mobile lifestyles were adapted, no people staying for longer than a few months in any one place. Yet some links of the previous life were retained. Abandoned villages were maintained as cemeteries. Groups periodically gathered at them to bury their dead communally, and in some cases bringing bags of bones or just skulls exhumed from temporary burials on their searches for food. It's possible that the period of sedentary lifestyles between 14,000 and 12,500 years ago had ingrained cultural attitudes that remained with the people during the Younger Dryas and were essential to the later development of farming villages. So in order to acquire the sufficient food during these drought conditions, it seems likely that people began to manage plants by weeding, replanting and watering. They probably began such practices many years previously when they lived in the villages, and these activities are well documented among recent hunter-gatherer groups. Wild plants were cultivated, which improved yields, allowed people to plan their movements. It was also an essential step towards the evolution of domesticated plants. So the key feature of domesticated cereals is that the grain remains on the stem as it ripens rather than being automatically scattered for self-seeding. So that means the farmer can retrieve the grain for use and retains sufficient for replanting. And similarly, domesticated peas remain within their ponds. They wait for the harvester, in the phrase of Daniel Zohari, the renowned specialist in plant domestication. So within the wild stands of wheat and barley, there would have been a few mutant plants that retained their seed in this fashion. And then the plant gatherers and cultivators of the younger dryas cut the cereals and collected seed grain to save and to plant elsewhere. It seems likely that the pre-farming plant cultivators soon discovered that wild cereals grew particularly well on the alluvial soils of the Jordan Valley, especially in the vicinity of natural springs. And then the marked increase in rainfall and warmth arrived with the sudden global warming of 11,600 years ago, and it was in this valley that people were able to return to the sedentary lifestyle. They also began to build mud brick houses. At Jericho, for example, where large stone tower and wall were constructed, probably as a defence against flooding and mud flows rather than for warfare. And a few kilometres north, the village of Netiv Hagdud was established. There are still traces of barley cultivation, although that might have been essentially wild plants. Both here and at Jericho there was a continuation and elaboration of the burial rituals of mobile hunter-gatherers of the younger dryas, especially the practice of removal and reburial of human skulls, and many of the tools stay the same as well. Similar developments occurred throughout the Fertile Crescent, and some of the most elaborate early Neolithic villages were built in southern Turkey and northeastern Iraq, where clay figurines suggest the emergence of a new ideology. Once these villages were established, there's no turning back on the path of farming. We know that the villages were linked to each other by trade networks for materials such as obsidian and seashells. And it seems likely that seed grain of fully domesticated plants also travelled along these networks. And then soon the villages had fields of cereals as well as peas and lentils to support populations and began to grow at a rapid rate. Within 1,000 years the first goats had been domesticated, followed by cattle. The villages turned into towns with large two-storey stone-built houses and streets and courtyards, storerooms. It was the culmination of the start of farming, a development that had its roots with the first sedentary hunter-gatherers of 14,500 years ago, ushered in by the climatic shock of the younger dryas, which set the scene for the emergence of the first civilization. There's a grinding stone there at Abu Hurayra. The start of farming brought a good deal of hard work, of course. And here is the Fertile Crescent in the arc of major river valleys, the first scene of the first farming settlements and the first civilizations. Number 25, the mysteries of rock art in the late Ice Age onwards worldwide. Sculpture and drawing almost simultaneously make their appearance, and the best examples attain so high a pitch of excellence that enthusiastic discoverers have spoken of them as superior in some respects to the work of the Greeks. Most of our archaeological material consists not of shining gold, but of detritus, things that are lost and abandoned when worn out, broken or useless. Of course, scholars write entire books about collections of fragments of pottery without ever having seen a single complete example of the vessels they're describing, and then trying to reconstruct the lives of the potters. But rock art is a direct record. Pictures from the past are preserved for us an image of how ancient people experienced their own worlds. Experienced is a much more accurate term than saw, because experience shapes what the human eye sees and takes notice of what it overlooks. So although it's at the Ice Age art from the French and Spanish caves that's the most famous, the majority of it is actually later in date, scattered across the world and found on open or slightly protected surfaces rather than deep in grottos. Wherever there is rock, there might be rock art, and many of the great rock art regions of the world, Scandinavia, the far western United States, the outback, are naturally enough rugged regions with much exposed rock. And at the same time, the rock art's distribution is capricious, in a way that hints at strong ancient patterns of alpine rock art. A million or two figures occur in just two North Italian valleys, Val Camonica and Valtellina, at about 30,000, or on just one French mountain, Mount Pego, while the rest of the mountain chain is only a couple of thousand figures altogether. Here are the sandstone rocks of Australia, carrying one of the great treasuries of rock art. It's an archaic image of a kangaroo painted in red ochre. Here on the right is the South African rock art that has famous elegance of line and colour. In the foreground is a line of eland antelopes, and then a large human figure in cloaks stand behind, and above run animated stick figures. At the Game Pass shelter, Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa. There are also images made by the technique of chipping away the rock surface, such as this bear at Alta in North Norway. That's lovely, that is. So, what of the world is depicted? It varies. There are pictures of kangaroos and echidnas in Australia, eland and springbok in southern Africa, bears and reindeer in Norway, but there's a strong consistency in the rock art of hunting peoples. Animals are nearly always predominant, and there's a deliberate choice at work. They're not usually the ones which would have been most common in the ancient landscape, or the ones whose bones we find in contemporary archaeological sites. So there's some strong selection for animals which had meaning in another way. So images of plants are rare, but they are of course harder to recognise with distinct shapes, unlike animals. So we know that hunting and gathering people depend more on plants than animals for their nutrition, and images of landscapes are practically unknown, so what's the reason for that? So the knowledge of hunter-gatherer peoples living today or who survived into historic times provide clues. Many hunter-gatherers hold certain animals special. Bears in the northern lands of Eurasia, bighorn sheep in the arid desert of the southeastern California, and these are the animals of the art. Some are connected by visionary experience, and we know their meaning. The bighorn sheep in California is related to rain making, found in the mountains close to Death Valley, the driest place in North America. Visionary understanding involving trance and the special knowledge and skills of shamans is commonplace in modern hunter-gatherer societies, so it's reasonable to expect it in hunter-gatherer societies of the past. A repeated emphasis on one animal species could indicate such beliefs, and so will other ways in which the feelings of trance, weightlessness, floating, flying, and otherness like death are expressed in visual metaphors. Perhaps this is how the archaic dynamic figures of North Australia should be interpreted. So the placing of rock art in caves in the Paleolithic of Ice Age Europe, as well as southeastern America and the Maya lands, makes sense in these terms. For such underground places, dark and inaccessible, are often regarded as places to encounter another world. Here is a human dynamic figure holding two boomerangs in one hand, and wearing a headdress and a great bustle behind the waist. From Arnhem Land in North Australia. And these are images of bighorn sheep packed into a basalt rock surface at Cusco Range near Death Valley, California, USA. So a repeated emphasis on one animal species might indicate beliefs, and such beliefs as this, and the feelings of trance and weightlessness and floating and flying and otherness and death are expressed here in visual metaphors. Perhaps this is how the archaic dynamic figures of North Australia should be interpreted. It's the placing of rock art in caves in the Paleolithic Ice Age of Europe, as well as Southeast America and the Maya lands, makes sense in these terms, because underground places which are dark and accessible, they're regarded as a place to enter another world. In the West today, most of us have a reduced spirit world. We don't believe in spirits or beings that are human-like, but other, living among us. And when we have first-hand access to knowledge about rock art, we often discover that pictures of animals and birds aren't what they superficially seem to be. A figure of a deer, for example, is a creature of a spirit world rather than a mundane and physical reality. And accordingly, when we look at prehistoric pictures, we need to think of them in two ways. On one level, we can interpret them as surface pictures. Images of bears and whales and halibut tell us that those creatures were found in the environment and they were known to its people. But the whale may have been more than a biological creature, and the image of the whale may have carried greater meaning. Here we have some theanthropic figures combining human elements with those of animals from the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa. And here is the rock art of the early farmers reflecting their experiences of their world and the innovations and artifacts of their new way of life. A four-wheeled wagon is drawn by two horses in Valcamonica, Brescia, North Italy. And here is the, on the right a human and on the left an animal-headed being in the Juar Northern Territory in Australia. So figures like these that we recognise as anthropomorphic, in the form of humans, they take a human form and they may at the same time belong in the spirit world, or they may not fall into one category. The Virgin Mary in Christian iconography is just a picture of a young woman, but she carries many and sacred meanings beyond her physical self. So when the image takes a form which is only partly human, we can be sure it has meaning beyond simple depiction, such as the water ghost woman who lives in the water and pulls mortals to their death, who's depicted in the rock art of the Bighorn Basin, Wyoming. It's a characteristic and unambiguous rock art motif connected with the spirit world that is the therianthrope, a single figure combining both human and animal elements. In South Africa, a human figure with the head and the flying fox, fruit bat. Often therianthropes are painted alongside or interacting with simple human depictions. Perhaps such figures are humans involved with animal spirits, or may themselves be spiritual beings. So as we see depicted in their rock art, the world experience of farming people is decidedly different from that of hunter-gatherers. So in Europe, the hunter-gatherer rock art of the later Ice Age gives way to a very different imagery in the Neolithic and Bronze Ages. The open-air and flat-stone surfaces rather than painted in shelters or caves. So although in the world of farming people, the later rock art of prehistoric Europe is far from an era when things are very different. The land below this Bronze Age rock engraving at Masselberg, Bohuslän, Sweden is now a ploughed field, which would have been a beach of a shallow bay when the figures were cut into its surface. That's amazing. That's just sitting there, isn't it, near a farm. The innovations and artefacts of this new farming way of life are conspicuous. Ploughs, oxen which pulled them, metal daggers, and harpoons, boats, timber, built houses. But there's a deliberate selection. In the Alps, a characteristic motif in rock art is the halberd, a kind of axe which is rare in the archaeological record. So we know that the halberd was special as an object, without knowing what it meant. Both daggers and halberds are characteristically associated with human figures that are gendered male. So we think their meaning was in some way man's business. The enduring mystery of rock art is in its origins, such as, unlike our ancient technologies such as pottery or stonework, which show a progressive improvement as craft skills develop. Early rock art is wonderfully accomplished. Two great new finds of painted caves in France, Coscar and Chavez, are fine, or finer than the celebrated cave of Lascaux, or seem decidedly early in date. So how is it that superb painting flashed up, already developed perfect even, rather than the climbing gradually from clumsy first essays? Perhaps it's just how we see it now, rather than how it actually was. Maybe there was a long evolution, but the early art was made on wood, or other perishable materials, or when on rock was exposed in the open and has not survived. The balance of evidence, however, still favours a sudden birth of accomplished images in art. Fascinating how art endures above all. That's why it should be a priority in any society. Thank you for joining me through this read-through of the mysteries of the Stone Age and the 70 great mysteries of ancient history. I look forward to having you join me next time. Until then.